Didn't scream at the funeral. I didn't fall apart at the graveside. I stood there in my black dress with my hands folded in front of me, and I watched them lower my son into the ground, and I felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with grief. It had to do with the man standing across from me. My son-in-law had his arm around my daughter's shoulders. He was crying, or doing something that looked like crying. His shoulders shook. His eyes were red. My daughter, Vanessa, leaned into him like he was the only solid thing left in the world. I watched him dab at his eyes with a folded handkerchief. White cotton, pressed. Who presses a handkerchief the morning of their brother-in-law's funeral? Someone who planned to be seen grieving. My son's name was Damon. He was 36 years old. He worked as a financial analyst at a mid-size investment firm in Atlanta. He coached youth basketball on Saturday mornings. He called me every Sunday at 7 p.m., without fail. Even when he was traveling, even when he was sick, even the Sunday before he died, when he sounded tired in a way I couldn't quite name. I asked him if he was all right. He said, "I'm handling something, Mama. I'll tell you about it soon." Soon never came. 3 days later, the police were at my door telling me my son had been found unresponsive in his apartment. Cardiac event, they said. Sudden. No signs of foul play. He was young, yes, but it happened. The coroner noted elevated stress markers. His potassium levels were off. They ruled it natural. I buried my son on a Thursday in March. The call came the following Monday morning, just after 9. "Mrs. Tatum." The voice was a man's, older, careful. "My name is Gerald Owens. I'm the property manager for the building where your son lived on Peachtree Dunwoody Road. I'm very sorry for your loss." I thanked him and waited. "I'm calling because, well, this is a little unusual, and I want to be respectful of your time." A pause. "When we were doing the walkthrough of the unit to catalogue Damon's belongings before the estate process, we found something inside the kitchen cabinet, behind a false panel, and I want you to know, we've had that model of cabinet before. The panel is a factory thing, not something he installed himself. We found a sealed envelope. His name is on it, but inside was a note addressed to you specifically, to his mother." My heart stopped. There's also a USB drive taped to the inside of the envelope. I was in my car within 20 minutes. Before I left, I almost called Vanessa. My hand was on the phone. Then I thought about the pressed handkerchief. I put my phone in my purse and drove. Gerald Owens was a heavy-set man in his mid-60s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He met me in the lobby and walked me up to the 4th floor himself. The apartment still smelled like Damon, his particular brand of cedar and coffee, and I had to stop in the doorway for a moment and breathe through it. The cabinet was in the kitchen, upper right corner. Gerald showed me how the panel released when you pressed the upper left edge. Inside was a plain white envelope, sealed with tape, my name written on the inside note in Damon's handwriting. "Mama, if you're reading this, something happened to me. Don't go to the police yet. Read everything first. And please, don't say anything to Kyle. Kyle, my son-in-law." I sat down at Damon's kitchen table, and I read. Damon had been suspicious of Kyle for almost a year. It started small, inconsistencies in expense reports at the company they both worked at before Damon moved to the investment firm. Kyle was still there, still climbing. Damon had noticed things during his last year at the firm that hadn't sat right. After he left, he kept a quiet eye on it, the way you do when you care about something even after it stops being your problem. He still had friends there. He still got lunch with people from that world. 6 months before he died, his former colleague, a woman named Phyllis who ran the accounts receivable department, caught him in a panic. She'd found a pattern she didn't understand and didn't feel safe bringing to the internal compliance team. Payments to a vendor that didn't appear in any contract database. Small at first, then larger. Consistent, untraceable to a real company. Damon spent 4 months documenting it quietly. He cross-referenced the vendor ID numbers with state business registration records in Georgia and 2 neighboring states. Nothing. He pulled what public filings he could access. He requested records under the pretense of a personal project. He built a timeline, The money, nearly $240,000 over 18 months, was being funneled out of client trust accounts in amounts small enough to avoid automatic triggers. The vendor name was a shell, and the authorization codes on every single transaction traced back to one login ID. Kyle's. I read that part 3 times. I set the letter down on the table and I looked out Damon's kitchen window at the Atlanta skyline and I thought about Vanessa, my daughter who had married this man 7 years ago in a garden ceremony in Piedmont Park, who had 2 kids with him, my grandchildren, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3, who loved him with the kind of easy certainty that comes from never having been given a reason to doubt. I picked up the letter and kept reading. Damon had confronted Kyle, not aggressively, he wasn't that kind of man. He'd asked for a meeting, told Kyle he'd found some discrepancies he wanted to understand before he took them to anyone else. He gave Kyle the chance to explain. Kyle told him it was complicated, that he'd borrowed the access to cover a short-term debt and planned to return the funds, that Damon didn't understand the pressure he was under, that Vanessa didn't know and it would destroy her if this came out, that Damon was his family and family handled things internally. That meeting happened on a Wednesday. Damon died the following Saturday night. The letter said, "I don't know that he did anything to me directly, but I need you to look at the USB drive. I put everything on it, the transaction logs, the timeline, the screenshots, the vendor registration research, and the recording of our conversation. I recorded it on my phone. I didn't tell him, if anything happens to me, that recording is the reason you should go to the police." My hands were shaking. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop right there at Damon's kitchen table. Gerald Owens quietly excused himself and waited in the hallway. The files were organized the way Damon organized everything in his life. Clearly, methodically, with labels that told you exactly what you were looking at. Spreadsheets, screenshots, a scanned copy of a business registration inquiry with "no records found" stamped in red, a PDF with a cover note from Damon, timeline of unauthorized transactions, cross-referenced with Kyle Beaumont's badge access logs provided by Phyllis, and at the bottom of the folder, an audio file, 43 minutes long. I put in my earbuds and I pressed play. I heard my son's voice, and then I heard Kyle's. I sat there for 43 minutes, and I listened to my son's killer explain himself. That is the only word I have for what Kyle was. Sitting at that table, in that moment, he was my son's killer. Maybe he didn't put his hands on Damon, but he knew Damon had everything. He knew Damon was going to use it, and 3 days after that conversation, my son was dead. Kyle's voice on the recording was calm, practiced. He talked about the debt, gambling debts, it turned out, owed to people who were not patient men, like it was a paperwork problem he'd been trying to sort out. He said numbers. He gave timelines of repayment that he clearly had no intention of meeting. He asked Damon to give him 1 month, then 2. He said Vanessa didn't need this stress while the kids were so young. Toward the end of the recording, something shifted. Kyle's voice got quieter. He said, "You're my brother, Damon. I need you to think about what you're about to do to this family." And Damon said, "I've been thinking about it for 4 months. I think you need to make this right, Kyle. Or I will." I closed the laptop. I sat in my son's kitchen for a long time. I cried eventually, the kind of crying that's been waiting too long that comes out ugly and silent. I cried for Damon. I cried for the Sunday phone call I would never get again. I cried for my grandchildren who were growing up in the house of the man who'd taken their uncle from them. Then I stopped crying and I made a plan. I did not go home and wait. I did not call Vanessa. I made 2 copies of the USB drive using a couple of blank drives Gerald Owens had in his office downstairs. God bless that man. He asked no questions and offered every resource he had. I put 1 copy in my purse, 1 in my car's glove box, and the original back in my own home safe that night. Then I called my cousin Lawrence, who spent 22 years as an investigator with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office before he retired. I told him I needed advice before I went to the police. He told me to come over immediately. Lawrence listened to everything. He looked at the files. He listened to 17 minutes of the recording. Then he set down my laptop, folded his hands, and said, "Iris, this is enough. But you need to walk into that police station with an attorney, not by yourself. Do not confront Kyle. Do not tell Vanessa yet. Let the evidence do the work. He called a colleague, a criminal defense and victims' rights attorney named Patterson, who agreed to meet with me the next morning. I went home that night and I sat in my kitchen and I looked at the family photos on my refrigerator. There was one from Thanksgiving 2 years ago, Damon standing next to Kyle, both of them laughing at something out of frame. Damon had his arm around Kyle's shoulder. He was always generous that way, always willing to give people more grace than they probably deserved. Kyle had used every bit of that grace to buy himself time. I want to be honest about something. I almost went to his house that night. I was sitting in my car at 10:15 p.m., keys in the ignition, and I knew his address, and I was 63 years old, and I had buried my only son 6 days ago. And there was a part of me that wanted to look Kyle Beaumont in the eyes and ask him if he felt anything at all. I didn't go. Lawrence's voice was in my head. Let the evidence do the work. I drove home. The meeting with the attorney the next morning lasted 2 hours. She reviewed everything and told me what Lawrence had already said. The evidence was substantial. The audio recording of Kyle's admission, combined with the documented transaction trail, the vendor registration evidence, and the timeline correlated to Damon's death, created a picture that law enforcement would take seriously. She noted that while a direct murder charge would depend on the medical examiner's findings being revisited, Kyle was facing federal-level financial crimes charges that were essentially airtight. She also said something I've thought about every day since. Your son knew this might happen to him. He built you a case. He protected you with the truth he couldn't deliver himself. We went to the Atlanta Police Department that afternoon. My attorney did most of the talking. I provided the drives, the letter, and a written statement. They assigned a detective to the financial crimes angle immediately and flagged the case for review by the medical examiner's office given the new information. It moved faster than I expected. Within 72 hours, Kyle Beaumont was contacted by investigators. Within a week, he had been placed on administrative leave from the firm while a full forensic audit began. The firm's own legal team, once they understood the scope of what had been happening in their accounts, cooperated fully and quickly. They had their own exposure to worry about. I had to tell Vanessa before it became news. That was the hardest conversation of my life. Harder than the police station, harder than reading Damon's letter. I drove to her house on a Sunday morning, the same day and time Damon used to call me, and I sat down with my daughter at her kitchen table, and I told her everything. She didn't believe me at first. Then she did. Then she stopped being my daughter for a few minutes and became something more primal. A mother of 2 small children, a woman who had shared her bed and her life and her grief with a man who had been lying to her through all of it. She asked me to leave. I understood. I drove home and I sat by the phone and I waited. She called me 4 hours later. She had taken the children to her friend's house. Kyle had come home to find her gone and a message from his attorney waiting on his phone. He had not called her back. She told me she needed time, and I told her to take all the time she needed. Kyle Beaumont was indicted on 11 counts of wire fraud and embezzlement 3 months later. The medical examiner's office, upon reviewing the case with the new timeline, requested an expanded tox panel on preserved samples from Damon's autopsy. The results showed a concentration of a potassium-based compound consistent with a specific pharmaceutical administered at high doses, something that can stop a heart and largely dissipates from the system quickly. It doesn't prove administration by another person, but it combined with everything else to give prosecutors what they needed to bring a charge of second-degree murder. Kyle is awaiting trial. I don't know what the jury will decide. I have learned at 63 that I cannot control what 12 strangers in a box will conclude. What I know is what I have. The recording of my son's voice. The evidence he spent 4 months building because he understood, somewhere in himself, that he might not be here to deliver it. He called me every Sunday at 7 p.m. He coached kids on Saturday mornings. He built a case file on a USB drive and hid it behind a false panel in a kitchen cabinet, because he loved me enough to make sure I would have the truth even if he couldn't give it to me himself. Vanessa is in therapy. My grandchildren are with her. She filed for divorce in June and Kyle moved out of the family home. She called me last Sunday at 7 p.m. She didn't say why. I didn't ask. We talked for 45 minutes about nothing and everything. And when we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and I talked to Damon the way I always do now. Out loud, the way I used to when he was alive, and I needed to say something I didn't know how to say to anyone else. I told him I got his message. I told him his sister was going to be okay. I told him I'm still angry, not the hot, immediate kind, but the kind that lives in you quietly and makes you careful, makes you pay attention, makes you refuse to let the people you love be taken without a fight. He was the one who taught me that. He spent 4 months fighting for the truth, quietly, methodically, at no small risk to himself. I spent a week fighting for what he built. That felt like the least I could do. If you are watching this and something about your loved one's death has never sat right with you, the explanation that came too fast, the person who cried too neatly, the call that came just a little too soon, I want you to hear me. Trust that feeling. Document everything. Don't confront anyone alone. Find a Lawrence in your life. Find a good attorney. Let the evidence do the work. And if your child leaves you something, the way Damon left me that envelope, read it. All of it. Even the parts that break your heart. Especially those parts. That's where the truth is. I keep thinking about the cabinet. That false panel in the upper right corner of Damon's kitchen, the one Gerald showed me how to open by pressing the upper left edge. I keep thinking about the fact that my son knew, not for certain maybe, but enough that he might not be around to hand me what was inside. He built that envelope for me the way a person builds something they hope never gets used. And then it got used. That's what I can't stop sitting with. Kyle made a choice rooted in something hollow, not just greed, but a particular kind of moral emptiness that tells you the people around you are tools for managing your own problems. He looked at my son, who had known him for years, who had called him family, and he calculated. He decided that his debt and his fear and his comfort mattered more than Damon's life. That is not a failure of circumstance. That is a failure of character. And character, I've learned, catches up with you. Not always on the timeline you want. Not always in the way you expect. But it catches up. Damon had that character, the right kind. What he did over those 4 months took a particular quality of mind that I don't think gets taught about enough. He didn't panic. He didn't confront Kyle with accusations he couldn't support. He sat down and he thought, and then he worked, quietly and carefully, and at real personal risk, to build something that would hold up under pressure. That's not just being smart. That's the kind of clear-headed discipline that separates people who act from people who react. He saw something wrong, and he chose to understand it fully before he moved on it. I wish I had told him more often how much I admired that about him. And then there was what he did with what he built. He didn't keep it for himself. He made sure that if the worst happened, I would have it. That kind of love, the kind that keeps planning for you even when it's afraid, that took everything he had. It took courage that most people never get tested on. He was 36 years old, and he was protecting his mother from beyond whatever he feared was coming. I don't have a word large enough for that. What I know is this. I almost didn't finish reading the letter. There was a moment at that kitchen table where the pain of his handwriting on the page nearly closed me down completely. I'm glad I kept going. I'm glad I called Lawrence instead of driving to Kyle's house that night. I'm glad I walked into that police station with an attorney and a USB drive instead of just my grief and my anger. Because the only thing that matched what Damon built was choosing to use it right. He did his part with everything he had. The least I could do was hold myself together long enough to do mine. If you are going through something that doesn't add up, a story that came too clean, a person who grieved too neatly, an explanation that settled too fast, don't let it go. Write it down. Find someone who knows how these things work. Don't walk into anything alone, and don't let anyone convince you that protecting the peace of the room matters more than finding the truth. Damon taught me that. He spent 4 months being quiet and careful and brave, in exactly the right order. I'm still learning from him.